Okay, here we go. Dog training made simple. And I'm going to start with a few terms that you'll hear often within books or videos or training forums, or if you're in clubs, people will talk about them. And I'm just going to break these down for the average, everyday pet owner so you understand what these terms mean and how they impact on the way that you train your dog. And the first thing that I'm going to talk about is the term classical conditioning. Conditioning plays a huge part in dog training and in the way that we all learn. But I'm going to talk about classical conditioning. And classical conditioning is basically, in a nutshell, when the environment causes a change in our behavior. The environment elicits, brings about a change within us, which is generally involuntary, but can also be voluntary. And it causes us to respond in accordance to the changing context, the changing environment. And the classic study that almost everybody is aware of is Pavlov's dog. You know, the dog that was taught to salivate at the sound of a bell. Because basically I give the dog food, the dog salivates. I present food, the dog salivates. I present food, the dog salivates. I then ring a bell, present food, the dog salivates. Ring a bell, present food, the dog salivates. Ring a bell, wait, whoa, dog salivating. Well, now I've got a dog that will salivate to the sound of a bell. Or to the presentation of the coat of the person who happens to be ringing the bell, or whatever, or the room that the dog goes into where the experiment's about to take place causes the dog to salivate, because the dog's got an association that in this context, this is what happens. And that's classical conditioning, is where I'm not necessarily doing anything other than responding to my environment. And how does that impact on dog training and on the way that your dog sees things? Hugely is the answer, because I can have a dog that behaves beautifully under certain circumstances. So perhaps when I have, when I take my dog into a particular field where I do all my training, I find that my dog behaves really nicely in that field or that hall. And when I take them out of that field or out of that hall, all of a sudden the behavior starts to fall apart and the dog isn't as responsive as it was, because the association with that environment is that I'm going to be required to perform certain behaviors. So I learn that when I'm in that environment, I act in a particular way. When I'm in the other environment, when I leave the field, then I start to work in accordance with how I understand that I should respond in that environment. And the two often aren't the same, which is where generalization of training comes in, which is so important, being able to show the dog in every other context. The same requirements are there. But basically, classical conditioning can play a part where if I'm heavy-handed with a dog, as a young dog, and I come in and I go through the whole dominance, growling, sort of, I'm the pack leader sort of thing. And then I get a dog that in the future, when it hears me come in or when it sees me come in, becomes submissive, becomes a little bit cowed. And I'm not talking about every case. This isn't a smash of people who go down the dominance route, but I'm just talking about the conditioning aspect, is that the presentation of myself causes a suppression in the behavior of the dog. The dog has become conditioned to associate me with impending or possible impending corrections, depending on how heavy my corrections are and how often I use them. Equally, somebody comes into the house, a certain person comes into the house, and the dog goes absolutely nuts and is jumping up at them and, goes over, and that person fusses the dog. And when that person's voice is heard in the hallway, even though they've not entered the room, my dog springs to life and becomes very animated and gets excited in anticipation of the person coming into the room. Because the association, the classical conditioning between the presence of that person, which is, to all intents and purposes, just a stimulus, like you'd introduce a light or a tone or anything else in scientific experiments, now we'll introduce a person. And what the person does is it causes an internal change within that dog, which then reflects in the behavior that the dog performs in anticipation of the person coming in. So they can be good, they can be bad. Classical associations, classical conditioning can be positive or it can be negative. But in a nutshell, so I'm trying, but in a nutshell, to break it down, classical conditioning is basically where the environment triggers a response from me, from the dog, from the person, from the subject. Right, seconds out, round two. Operant conditioning, lovely. Operant conditioning, unlike classical conditioning, and just to recap, classical conditioning is where the environment triggers or elicits an internal change and subsequent external change within me. So classical conditioning is where the environment affects me, causes change within me. Operant conditioning, on the other hand, is where I cause a change within the environment. By doing certain things, I can make the environment alter, generally for the better for me. Because ultimately every animal, every species is really looking to try and make things better for themselves. So I'm constantly on the lookout as to how can I make things work to my advantage. And if I can adjust my behavior and cause changes in the environment, which improve my state of affairs, either short or long term, I'm going to repeat those behaviors. Okay, operant conditioning. What I do affects what happens to me. And it's, if you think about it, it's common sense, isn't it? You know, I mean, everybody does it. The same was with classical conditioning. If you go into an exam room and the exam room makes you feel, you know, either anxious, nervous, afraid, or whatever it is, or excited, depending on your previous success in exams, but the thought of exams coming up will generate responses within you. How I do, what I do, you know, how my behavior is conducted will affect my environment, will affect the results, will affect the consequences, right? So the consequences is a huge factor in operant conditioning, also known as trial and error learning, which is self-explanatory, isn't it? I try it, it works for me. I do it again. I try it, it doesn't work for me. I'm unlikely to do it again. I try it, it's brilliant. I'm definitely going to do it again. I try it, it was horrible. I'm definitely not going to do it again. Operant conditioning is where I learn by my own actions and I affect the environment, hopefully to my advantage, by what I do. Clicker training, marker training, all rely on operant conditioning. Operant conditioning is something that was studied hugely in the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, and a lot has been taken from the laboratory, from the work of the behaviorists, with regards to how animals will adjust their behavior in order to improve their state of affairs. I'm going to end it there because if I keep going on, I'm just going to keep repeating the same thing. The idea is that it's simple and I don't want to go into greater depth. But what I am going to come on to is the concept of the you'll love this, the quadrants of behavior. All right, which is something that a lot of people who even people who think that they understand the quadrants of behavior get themselves bogged down with this, because it's so, in a lot of ways, it's nonsensical, because you cannot label one thing in a particular way. It's very, very specific to the individual. But we'll come on to that. I'll chat about it in just a moment and break that down, hopefully to make it really simple to understand. But what you'll notice with a lot of this, like with classical conditioning, the environment causes a change within me. Operant conditioning, I cause a change within the environment. It's common sense. It's common sense given big names, given lots of studies, given a ton of scientific research into it. But the fact is, it comes down to the fact that it existed way before that research was done. It existed way before those books were written. It is common sense. It is life. All right. So training dogs ultimately is common sense. It isn't difficult. I'm going to move on to the next one.